Joseph Bullis will speak on the Holocaust, the reality. Dr. Bullis is the Associate Director of the Holocaust Center of Northern California, which is located in San Francisco. We've been very fortunate in having from the faculty of Sonoma State some excellent scholars. Today we are fortunate to have one of them, Dr. Dennis Harris. Dr. Dennis Harris is a distinguished scholar and historian, and he did his doctoral work on foreign relations. He's also a consulting historian. His topic today is cultural prejudice to racial tribalism. We welcome Dr. Harris.
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to start with a series of disclaimers to begin. I am an American diplomatic historian. My field is not European history. At least my original training was American diplomatic history, not European history. Although one cannot deal with American diplomatic history without knowing a great deal about Europe. And I come to this, therefore, not as a scholar of modern European history, and certainly not as a scholar of the Holocaust. The second disclaimer is that in dealing with the shift from tribalism to the virulent race hatred that explains the final solution as it's implemented in 1941 and following, I'm dealing in social psychology, which is even less a field of my talent and expertise. So bear with me and keep in mind that I am fully dependent upon the works of others in making my comments. What I want to do today is to, first of all, make some observations about the nature of prejudice in the abstract, about discrimination, which is one outcome of one kind of prejudice, first in the abstract and then in specifics. I want to then turn to certain late 19th and early 20th century phenomena that I think go far to explain which led to the rise of the preconditions for the final solution. And these include the Romantic movement. They include the naturalist ideology of the turn of the century. They include, most importantly, the national outcome of World War I. And you have a handout, at least if you don't, you should. There are a few copies here. There are a few copies on the table. I don't know where the rest of them went, but if you don't, I will be referring to that, at least the first table, particular point. And then, of course, there's one other disclaimer I need to make, and that is, unfortunately, I wasn't here for Bob Brown's lecture, and I had to leave halfway through Rabbi Lowe's lecture, so I'm really not totally familiar with what my predecessors said. And before I even begin my presentation, I'd like somebody to summarize Bob's thesis for me, so I know what I'm walking into, if you will. I think I know Rabbi Lowe's thesis, but I'm not sure, because I heard Bob Brown give a lecture, I think, like the one he gave a couple years ago, but Bob doesn't totally repeat his lectures. At least I don't think Bob does. So would somebody do me a favor and just succinctly state Brown's thesis?
Well, he juxtaposed that the German nationalism came to life under Bismarck, and there was a climate during World War I such that the losers, the Germans, were forced to pay outrageous reparations to the respective allies, and thus were in a position not only because of preserving the military intact
So for Bob, then, at least a cardinal explanation is in the peculiarities of German Nazis. It's shaped and, if you will, warped by World War I, by Versailles, and by the interwar period. Could somebody do me the same favor for Rabbi Lowe? Yeah. I have problems with that thesis, which I'll state right now, but I'll be more than happy to deal with in more detail later. And that is, if that is the case, then why does it take 1941 years using the Christian calendar to get there? But let me pursue that later. He had a,
It also showed that Christianity had to make a differentiation between Judaism and Islam in order to make
Yeah.
Christianity stand out instead of just being central.
and deicide was part of that. Yeah. Okay. Let's get to the beginning of this lecture, and then I'll pick up on those two interpretations later on. Let's start with some fundamental assumptions. First of all, prejudice is in the nature of the beast, if you will. It is in the nature of human beings. We are social beings. We are group creatures by our very nature. And indeed, our survival as a species has depended upon us being able to build groups. It's our survival, it's our development, it's our prosperity, not only as groups but as individuals. The group creates, not consciously, but it creates a culture that gives it discipline as a group, that gives it order as a group, that gives it security and predictability as a group, gives that order, predictability, security, and discipline to its members. It's a condition of the success of the group, of whatever human group we're talking about, that its members be loyal to it. And loyalty, in fact, means being prejudiced in favor of that group and its culture. There is in all groups an in-group and an out-group feeling. There are we and they, and there's abnormal about this whatsoever. If the group's members lose that sense of loyalty, it is that prejudice in favor of itself, the group loses its cohesion, it loses its internal discipline. The lives of the members of the group are made insecure, both physically and mentally. And the group is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to attack by other groups whose lives and whose cohesion are far stronger than its. Thus, we have to start with a human condition, prejudice, loyalty to one's group. What loyalty to one's group's values? They're normal features of human life. To say somebody is prejudiced is to say that somebody is human. It doesn't say anything, really. In simple societies, prejudice is also very, very, very simple. Family, the clan, the tribe. In those societies, the in-group's clear. It's the family, it's the clan, it's the tribe. It's also unquestioned. We know who we are. And the out-groups are equally simple, clear, and distinct. They're that clan, that family, that tribe. Okay. In advanced societies, it's not so simple. In developed modern nation states, which we'll be dealing with, the state itself is a community of communities. Individual members belong to many and various groups. They owe loyalty to their family, to their clan, to their tribe, if they still think in those terms, to their church, their school, their profession, to their political organization, to their regional group, to extranational movements, as well as to the nation in which they're organized. And that, in a lot of ways, is a good thing. That complexity of loyalties and prejudices is a liberating factor for most human beings in most nation states at most times. It gives us choices among prejudices, if you will. It frees us, them, members of nation states, from permanent and inescapable dependence upon a single group and single group's prejudices. It offers the opportunity, if we choose to take it, for rational selection among competing loyalties, among competing suspicions, among competing hostilities. The multi-group society, in other words, gives people the opportunity of, in fact, thinking about and changing their prejudices, changing them into what we typically call principles. And that's a good. But the complexity of group structures also creates problems. It causes strain for us as individuals. It causes insecurity for us as individuals. It means a multiplicity of occasions for not only loyalty but also suspicion, for competition and for friction among groups and among us as members of competing groups. Okay. In simple homogeneous society, prejudice is directed almost exclusively against other societies, societies that are outside, that are they. In complex, heterogeneous societies in modern nation states, it produces a tangled network of internal hostile prejudices, many of which are atavistic, many of which are irrational, neurotic attitudes that reproduce in deeply instilled fears and hatreds of strangers that may once have been necessary for the survival of the tribe, the clan, the family, but in fact are prejudicial to the survival of the nation state. Let's take one other fact about prejudice. It's learned behavior. You're not born with it. It doesn't come with the gene pool. It's not in the DNA. It is, as Theodore Hesburgh said, something learned. We foster it and we pass it on to others. It begins because we as a group, we as a culture, if you will, have a perception of difference. Difference of color, difference of language, difference of religion, difference of social or economic situation, of physical appearance, and even sex, and all kinds of other differences we perceive. We follow this difference, unfortunately, with an evaluation and with a comparison. We very quickly determine that what we have or what we are is best, and that whatever anybody else has or whatever is different from that is therefore inferior to that. It starts, in other words, with a contrast. There's the Occidental and the Oriental. There's the Irish, there's the English. There's the Arab, there's the Jew. There's the Yankee, there's the Cavalier. But then we naturally categorize our perceptions, and we attribute unfavorable qualities to this or that category. Instead of the white and the black, or it used to be called the white and the Negro, it's the shiftless Negro. Instead of the Christian and the Jew, it's the sly Jew. Instead of the Protestant and the Catholic, it's the politically ambitious Catholic. Instead of the European and the Chinese, it's the cruel Chinese. Our kind, whatever we are, whatever we are to be preferred over all others. Sociologists call this ethnocentrism when it's positive prejudice. Theologians, particularly somebody like Theodore Hesburgh, who doesn't like prejudice in any of its forms, would call it pride, and pride is a Christian sin. Actually, pride is a Christian, a Judaic, and a Muslim sin, but that's another issue. For Hesburgh, whatever it's called, prejudice is wrong. Unfortunately, it's also and if we attempt to eliminate prejudice, we'd be doing the ridiculous, the futile, and probably for human beings, the cruel. So we're really not concerned with prejudice. Prejudice is a fact of life. What we're concerned with is discrimination. What we're concerned with is overt behavior which results from negative prejudicial attitudes. Put on the board the 5 levels of discrimination that Gordon Allport has done The Nature of Prejudice. And I think they're important to recognize at the beginning so that we can separate the Holocaust from other acts of prejudicial behavior. And these are in ascending order of consequence. There is, to begin with, the verbal antagonism. I'm speaking to an American audience, and I'm sure you're all aware that the American language is with derogatory slang terms which encapsulate a history of American prejudice and discrimination. Wasp, Mick, Chicano, Wop, Nigger, Dago, Polak, Hunky, Kike, Redskin, Heine, Paleface, Greaser, Nip, Jap, Chink, Cheney, Koi, Guinea, Coon, Gook. I mean, I could go on forever. The list is endless. And that's all antagonism. That's all prejudice. It's all negative. But it doesn't result in an Auschwitz, necessarily. The second step in Allport's system is to avoid those we have defined by our verbal antagonisms, to not associate with the WASP, the MIC, the Chicano, etc. That's done individually. It's done collectively, but it's typically done without the assistance of the state. The third level is a little bit more severe and does require the state. It requires the group to effectuate. And that is the institutionalized segregation, the exclusion in many and different ways of the disliked group. The quota system that used to operate at Harvard and said how many blacks, how many Jews, how many of this and that could be taken in. The restrictive covenants in the subdivision laws of 1920s America, which said to whom and to whom not you could sell, and all the other forms in which institutionalized segregation takes place, both here, now, South Africa now, and elsewhere, both now and in the past, and I'm sure in the future. The fourth stage takes even more complicity, if you will, the state. And that is physical threat, actual attack, terrorism. The St. Louis race riots of 1919. The Zoot Suit riots of 1942. The willingness of the state to stand idly by, or perhaps even assist, while its members group carries out attacks upon the symbols of a disliked group, the property of a disliked group, or the members of the disliked group itself. And then there's that last stage which in fact is the subject of this whole series, extermination. And extermination has its own degrees of order, if you will. It can be the ad hoc and individual lynching to which my own society has been too often guilty. It can be the systematic and periodic pogroms carried out by Russians, Poles, and others throughout European history. And of course it can be genocide. But the Turks against the Armenians, that of the Germans against the Jews, that of one African tribe against another since World War II. Problem with this stage theory, if you will, of prejudice for Allport, or for us, is, as Allport notes, that each step taken by a social group in this stage of discrimination makes the next step all the easier to make. The second problem, the one that's even more important, is that the 20th century has made it all the easier to move from stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. The advances in transportation, the advances in communication have made for ever more rapid movement up the scale of discrimination. Technology has provided the totalitarian state particularly with the power to exploit prejudice on a scale that was not possible before the modern era. Then there's another thing about prejudice. There's a particular kind of prejudice that we're really dealing with, and that's race prejudice, or we've shortened it to racism. It's a particular form of prejudice, and it's a peculiar form of prejudice. Its antithesis is cultural prejudice, prejudice in favor or against some learned cultural phenomenon, some mental, moral, behavioral, technical, religious attitude. Attitudes which are learned, which can be changed and modified by reason and by experience. Cultural prejudice, in other words, has a remedy for the victim of the cultural prejudice. Race prejudice doesn't. It's prejudice against an ineradicable racial difference, against racial traits which are physical, inherited, and usually highly visible. But it's really not against traits. Race prejudice isn't prejudice against the physical traits. It's against certain cultural phenomena that we associate with the racial physical traits. There's a lot of disagreement among physical anthropologists about what is the meaning and what are the classifications of races, and I'm not a physical anthropologist, among other things. But typically, we divide the races, if you will, into Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and Negroid, and that should give us three forms of Mongoloid racism, Caucasoid racism, and Negroid racism, all based upon geographical separation and the gene theory of heredity. If that's true, then literally there's no basis for a reference such as the Teutonic race. It's a non sequitur. It makes no sense. The Anglo-Saxon race, in which Winston Churchill so desperately believed. The Jewish or the Celtic race. These are, in fact, attempts to take a recognizable cultural pattern once handed down by heredity, handed down down from generation by culture, and then explain that in terms of some physical heredity. What we're dealing with is, in fact, ethnic, not racial identification. But we have a peculiar problem. We Western Europeans in particular, and Americans are Western Europeans. Nathan Glaser has noted in his book, Judaism, there is one distinction between the Jews and other groups that is so significant that we must consider it at the outset. Judaism is tied up organically with a specific people, indeed a nation. The tie is so intimate that the word Jew in common usage refers ambiguously both to an adherent to the religion of Judaism and to a member of the Jewish people. In other words, ethnic and religious connotations are, in the eyes of most observers, inseparable in the concept of Jewry and of Jewishness. Okay, now let me get to Rabbi Lowe's lecture. Because anti-Semitism existed, as he was careful to point out, long before there was an Adolf Hitler. That particular form of prejudice, that particular form of discrimination against Jews, which we commonly refer to as anti-Semitism, has a long and an ignoble history. Literally, it's not anti-Semitism at all, because there are other Semitic peoples, other descendants of Shem, the word origin. The Babylonians are Semites, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, all those ancient tribes are Semites. The Arabs and Palestinians of today are Semites. What we're really dealing with is Judeophobia, with aversion to Judaism and to Jewry. But I'm not going to, for the rest of this lecture, try to use the term Judeophobia because it's not part of my language any more than it is yours, and we'll stick with the popular misuse of the term Semitism. Rabbi Lowe last week traced one of what, in fact, are four phases of discrimination against Jews in history. That phase, which has its origins in Christianity and reached its height in medieval and early modern persecution, conducted not only by Latin Christians, followers of the Pope in Rome, but also by Greek Christians, followers of the Eastern Church. The first phase, in fact, preceded Christianity. Both the Hebrew scriptures and the writings of Tacitus and Horace and a host of others make very clear that religious and ethnic persecution was heaped upon the Jews, that it was done so because, according to its practitioners, the Jews were atheistic. They were atheistic because, as monotheists, they refused to acknowledge the other gods that were running around out there. They were also persecuted because they were anti-humanists. Anti-humanists because they proclaimed themselves the chosen people and set themselves apart from the rest of humanity, in much the same way that Chinese have typically described the rest of the humanity as barbarians. The third phase, the one Rabbi Lowe, at least while I was here, didn't really touch upon in the history of anti-Semitism, is the 8th century relaxation of Christian fanaticism. Secularism, humanism, reason, the ideals of the Enlightenment brought an era in Western Europe, at least, not so much in Eastern Europe, in which Alpert's third stage, institutional segregation, broke down. Did not disappear, but broke down. Unfortunately, the 19th century, in response to the 18th century Enlightenment, gave us two movements that worked against this relaxation. Romanticism, particularly by its emphasis upon the germ theory of nations. I don't want to go into that theory now. And naturalism, by its pseudoscientific explanation of the origin not only of species, as Darwin did in 1859, but also of ethnic groups, and in the case of Karl Marx, even of economic systems. I'll get back to these two movements shortly, but for now I want to turn to the results of the Romantic movement and the Naturalist movement. And indeed, results which come out at the last stages of the Enlightenment, particularly as I refer to nation states. First and foremost, the ostensible, and I emphasize the word ostensible, triumph of liberal democratic nationalism in what was once referred to as the democratic revolutions, those that took place in the United States in 1770 and in France in 1789. That whole host of nation states which came in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars and reached some culmination with the unification of both Germany and Italy in 1870. And then most particularly, the imposition of that vision of nationalism by the victors in World War I upon the vanquished in World War I. The emergence of the successor states in 1919 and also in the war in 1919, those in 1920, 21, 22. I put up on the board, just so we can all have reference to it, a map of Europe between the wars for a number of reasons, one of which it is the successor states, the newly independent Poland, Slovakia, that linguistic union of Slovaks and Czechs, an ethnic Hungary, if you will, a truncated version of the historic Hungarian kingdom, with 3/4 of its territory gone, 2/3 of its linguistic population scattered elsewhere in the hands of Czechs, Romanians, and Yugoslavs, with a truncated Austria, the other part of that unnational empire, the German-speaking and very German national Alpine and Danubian provinces of the former empire, people who wanted to go with Germany but who were not permitted by the Versailles Treaty to go with Germany. And that's important to keep in mind in terms of what's going to happen. Yugoslavia, that South Slav union of Slovaks and of Croats and Slovenes and Serbs, of a nationalist Turkey, deprived of its Arab provinces, and of the Russian successor states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and what had triumphed at the end of World War I is Europe's own peculiar brand of nationalism. It's not the only kind of nationalism that's out there, but it's Europe's brand of nationalism. The boundaries drawn in 1919 and in the wars that followed conformed more closely to the linguistic frontiers of Europe than any boundaries that have been drawn before or since in European history. One of the things that amazes me on this campus today is I could not find a linguistic map of the continent to show you that better than that. I can't believe that we don't have such a map, but we don't. But the importance of those lines is that Europeans tended to make the prevalence of a common speech the criterion of nationality. If one spoke Polish, one was a Pole by nationality. One did not, then it followed one was not a Pole. They also equated language, race. One and the other were synonymous. There are some very bad implications in that set of assumptions. After 1919, insofar as linguistic nationals were not included within the new boundaries, for the nationalist, it was axiomatic that the boundaries needed to be redrawn to include all the linguistic nationals. Not Germans, but all linguistic nationalists viewed those boundaries that way. It's also true that insofar as there were linguistic groups within those new national boundaries, those groups needed to be dealt with. They needed to be denationalized. That's the old world word for genocide. They needed to be denationalized. That is, they needed to be rid of that nationality which they supposed to because they did not speak Polish. We'll use that as the example. Or they could be assimilated, or they could be removed. But somehow there was a cancer within the body politic. Of all the minority races in all the European successor states, with the exception of the Germans, the Jews were both the most numerous and the most easily identifiable. If you look at that chart, that ethnic map, ethnic table that I passed out, you can see the problem that I'm trying to lay out, and that I think fascism in general and Nazi Germany in particular was in part at least addressing. I'm using pre-war population statistics. The years vary tremendously, but for most they're about 1930. I don't have commas where they ought to be, but there wasn't enough space to put commas where they belonged. But you can see that at least for those states for which I have figures, no state was 100% made up of ethnic nationals. It varied from a high of Latvia at 97% ethnic nationals to, well, it's a phony low. It's Switzerland with 1%. Switzerland is that strange country that's made up of 4 groups and doesn't have if you will, a Swiss nationality. But in particular, look at Czechoslovakia, which is 66% ethnic nationals, 22% Germans, 5% Magyars. Magyars don't particularly like Czechs and Slovaks. We know that. A long history of them not liking them. Of Hungary, 75% Magyar, 6% German. And a lot of Magyars left out of Hungary. Poland, 69% ethnically Polish, 2% German, and it has some other people in it. And then look at the minorities, where they're located. That potential fifth column that Germans represent. In Austria, where they are 93% of the population, Austria is German. In Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Hungary, Lithuania, Yugoslavia, throughout Middle Europe, there was that potential German fifth column, if you will. The Magyar fifth column in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, and elsewhere. And then most particularly, forget the Russian and Ukrainian, for a while, at the Jewish population and at the Gypsy population. Two groups who could not possibly join a country because there was no country in Europe for them to join. Two groups who could not become ethnic nationals without giving up their entire culture. Two groups who would, in the ideology of National Socialism, be scheduled for extinction because there was, in this frame of reference, no place for them to go. Hannah Arendt, and all the other notable things that she has said in her career, noted that with the signing of the minorities treaties after World War I, the transformation of the state from an institution of law into an instrument of the dominant national community had been completed. That's what we're dealing with, a state that is the instrument of a dominant national community. Surplus population might be readily deprived of meaningful rights by denationalization or be disposed by expulsion. She's talking about Europe as a whole. She's not talking about Germany. She's not talking about the Germany of Adolf Hitler. I might add one other consequence of World War I. According to Robert Rubinstein, never before had human beings been so expendable as they were in World War I. It's his argument that the foundations of 20th century military slaughter on a mass scale were laid during the First World War. The foundations of mass civilian slaughter were laid immediately thereafter in the Russian Revolution, Civil War, demographic violence, large-scale famine, an experience that hit all of Central and Eastern Europe. Okay. There's one other aspect of World War I that needs to be dealt with, and that's the class of ideologies, if you will. At Versailles, for Woodrow Wilson, Lloyd George, and the other architects of the Versailles Treaty, the world seemed to be poised to leap into one of two futures: the liberal, democratic capitalism of Wilson's own utopia, or the Marxian socialism of the emerging Soviet dictatorship of the proletariat. Neither Wilson nor his nemesis Nikolai Lenin perceived a third route, the one most Europeans would in fact choose in the 1930s. H.R. Kirkwood, who in his study of fascism, is that the power of fascism rested upon one of the most intricate syntheses in all of modern history. It took ideas, methods, and attitudes from conflicting sides and presented the world with a unity so full of contradictions that it in fact gained strength. It synthesized major 19th century European intellectual currents into a new 20th century ideology, which was in fact far more appealing than Wilson's utopian ideology or Nikolai Lenin's. Instead of choosing between socialism and capitalism, between rationalism and irrationalism, between civilized and the primitive, between the mass and the elite, the European fascists offered an ideology which combined elements of each alternative into a new organic unity and in fact bested both liberalism and communism. Between socialism and capitalism, fascists adopted elements from socialist theory and practice, and yet contrived to attract the strongest supporters of capitalism. They did this not just in Germany, they did this in Italy, in Hungary, in Romania, in Spain, in Portugal, Britain, in France, and to some extent in the United States. They succeeded in attracting large numbers of all classes. Classes who felt themselves either excluded by or threatened by the two dominating systems, capitalism and socialism. And they saw in fascism, in this economic battle, a way out of the conflict which promised to engulf Europe in social chaos and in civil ruin. The same thing between rationalism and irrationalism. Between both Enlightenment reason, the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham, and the positivism of Auguste Comte on the one hand, you might add to that the rationalism of Karl Marx and the socialists, and the irrationalism that of Plekhanov and Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Bergson and Martinetti, the fascists leaned toward the latter. They leaned toward the irrational. But to irrational, they added a calculated rational appeal to the frightened middle classes. They were the party of both energy and control, of violence and order. The revolt and the anarchism of the irrationalist in the 19th and early 20th centuries were the background to the fascist freedom of expression and uninhibited love of aggression and emotional action. But the rationalist side was equally pronounced. They used the rationalist love of order and authority, its self-confidence, its dogmatism, its great and its great appeal to the settled classes of society. And by doing so, they incorporated into fascist theory and practice the very attitudes upon which the irrationalist had rejected rationalism. Italian fascism, German Nazism, contrived both to assault and defend society at one and the same time. The third way, as the fascists called their way, lay as seductively between rationalism and irrationalism as it did between socialism and capitalism. They did the same thing in the clash between civilization, or the civilized and the primitive. Between the 18th century spirit of reason and inquiry, the Renaissance glorification of the civilized, the idea of progress, and its much stronger 19th century equivalent, the material progress of technology, on the one hand, and then that 19th countercurrent, that contrary interest in the uncivilized, in the natural, and in the primitive. The Romanticism of Sir Walter Scott, of Chateaubriand, of Goethe, made the medieval and the folk world the object of adulation. A pride in nationality was part of that Romanticism, stirred by stories of ancient heroes, by folk songs and myths which were written down and distributed to inspire national music and poetry, the searching out of the roots of language for signs of cultural origins. What von Herder did for the Germans and Mazzini did for the Italians, others did for the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks and the Magyars and Slavs. Then you add to this the 19th century discoveries in natural science, most particularly Darwinism. The Darwinian theory of evolution shattered the complacency of the civilized world. It suggested that animal nature and nature were close and related, that both were driven by instinctual drives, that both were ruled by the survival of the fittest. And this bastardized Darwinism reached its zenith in race theory, most particularly in the race theory of Gobineau and his glorification of the Aryan race, the Germans. In fascism, and by the way, all of Europe had its race. I don't know of a nationality that didn't have a race theorist that put its nationality up at the top and somehow managed to rank the others down at the bottom. The French did it, the Norwegians did it, the Americans did it, as well as the Italians, the Germans, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and others. But in fascism, elements of these two were brought together. The primitive was enthroned, we know it, in party rituals, in the use of the ancient symbol, and above all, in racialism itself. All fascisms used Darwinism. All fascism used notions of struggle and survival, of competition and of the elimination of the unfit, of a concept of racial superiority. Brutality in political action was one of the most consistent aspects of fascism wherever it raised its head. In itself, that brutality was one of the most blatant rejects of civilized values. Brute force allowed fascists to act out their fantasies of being all-powerful, heroic, superhuman, and part of the ancient beast. But fascism balanced that primitivism with a cogent display of civilization. The benefits of modern society, its technological wonders, its material progress, these were exploited, these were continued by the fascist. They married evolutionary ideas with supreme confidence and by doing so claimed wherever they were and whatever nationality they were, that they were at the very pinnacle of Western civilization. There was another contrast that they were able to work with. The contrast between the mass and the elite. Between Tom Paine and Edmund Burke. Between Rousseau and de Maistre. Between Marx and Hegel. That is thesis and antithesis. I think each and every one of those are. Fascism came up with synthesis, with mass politics merged with the ideal of strong leadership. They built upon the rejection of parliamentary democracy, which was contained in the works of Marx and George Sorel. But then, and like Sorel, insisted that all great social changes came when a mass movement rose up against its enemies and was inspired by some dominating ideal of the future. They merged with the European left in this belief in mass politics. But then they merged that with this right-wing theory of rule by an elite. The mass who rose up in support of fascism was not the proletariat. It was a mass of people from all classes, inspired by the fascist ideals of strength, of national power, and of authority. That's the intellectual background that has to be understood. What I want to do now, and I'll do this briefly, is go through some of the varieties of fascism, some of the implementations of fascism. And I've been asked to make sure that I conform to what was the advertised schedule rather than what has been the actual schedule. So hopefully there will be some time left for discussion. Okay. I'm going to start where fascism started, or at least where it was first politically used, and that, of course, is Italy, not Germany. Indeed, Benito Mussolini was Adolf Hitler's hero, his mentor, his ideal, his model. And Mussolini didn't start from scratch. He started from a poet, not his own poetry, although he did write a little bit of poetry. It's absolutely atrocious, but he did write some. He started from the space of the poet D'Annunzio, who was not a full-fledged fascist, I think it's safe to say, but who founded what became the Fasci in March of 1919. It was D'Annunzio who offered the symbols that we've come to associate with fascism. The colored shirt. The color varies depending upon country. In the United States it was brown. In France it was blue. In Italy it was black. And the symbol, the ancient symbol, in Italy the symbol is the fascio. That bundle of rods with an axe, the token of state power that was carried ahead of the consuls in ancient Rome. And the symbol was chosen to represent the historic past. D'Annunzio offered the revanchism that was offered by all fascists, that restoration of the motherland or fatherland, whichever it is in the language of the fascist of the moment. He did so by, in 1919, seizing the port of Fiume, which he did in the name of Italian right and Italian history, not in the name of the law of the Versailles or of the spoils of World War I. In 1921, D'Annunzio offered, when a social revolution seemed imminent in Italy, an alternative in Italy which capitalized on the fears of the middle class, and he sold himself to the people as the patriotic answer to the red socialist danger and to the political chaos of ineffective liberalism in Italy. Mussolini joined that movement. He left his socialist ranks. In 1921, as I think almost all of us know, the fascists were successful. They elected 35 delegates to Parliament. In a story that's to be repeated elsewhere, in 1922, with the support of conservative nationalists, older conservative and liberal politicians alike, the Pope, many of the army leaders, considerable percentage of the civil servants of Italy, the policemen, journalists, and the landowners. Benito Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy. He took longer than would his follower. In 1925, when the socialists and the liberals and the Catholics had joined together in a common front against Mussolini, it was then that he abolished the trappings of parliamentary government and established the totalitarian regime which would rule Italy until 1943 and which would typify fascist regimes elsewhere. And once in power, he turned, as other fascists would turn, he turned loose his followers. He turned them into anti-socialists, into strikebreakers, into custodians of private property. He gradually built up an alliance between fascism and capitalism, an unholy alliance if you think of the intellectual underpinnings of capitalism. And he got the capitalists themselves to succumb to the allures of the new organic economy, the corporate state, another characteristic of fascism wherever it would appear. As with the other fascist leaders, those who would follow him, he offered a mythical past. In this case, it was ancient Rome. He offered a new world order, the reestablishment of the Roman Empire. He offered a new master race, the Roman race. He offered a collection of inferior races, the Albanians. We know what he tried to do in Albania. The Abyssinians, we know what he did there. The Gypsies, whom he rounded up, concentrated in staging areas, and then shipped off to the offshore islands to meet their fate away from pure Romans. And, of course, Jews, for whom restrictive legislation was adopted in 1937. That's the model. It's a model we see repeated elsewhere. I'm going to do this out of chronological order a little bit, because I want to turn to some other fascisms. In France, fascism didn't gain power until the establishment of the Vichy regime following the German conquest. But its roots go back to 1905, to the founding of the Action Française. In the case of French fascism, not surprisingly, the master race is not the Romans, it's the Gauls. The inferior races against whom the Action Française fought in World War I are the Germans, the Jews, the Gypsies, liberals, socialists, communists, and supporters of Dreyfus, no matter what their politics. As a fully articulated fascist movement, it really didn't appear until 1936, and maybe in some ways it owes some of its origins both to Mussolini in Italy and to Hitler in Germany. Because it was in 1936 that Doré organized the Parti Populaire Français, the French Popular Party. The name is important. And with it, its mouthpiece, journal, Emancipation, my French doesn't exist, National Emancipation, let's do it in English. And it offered itself as an alternative to communism, to republicanism, and to what it called Jewish capitalism. But it really took the German victory in 1940. It took the proclamation of the new order in Europe. Remember, Hitler declared a new order not in Europe, to create both a divided France and a French Civil War and a Vichy government. And it was under Pétain that Action Française, its followers, were able to offer a vision for France which was similar to that Mussolini had offered for Italy. Pierre Laval, Charles Maurras, now too could offer a purified nationalist state with Jews, communists, gypsies gone, removed, the state purified. me jump. I'm going to jump over Germany, if you will, and look at Poland, which we do not normally list as a fascist state. But from the beginning of post-war Poland, from January of 1919, the strongest single party in the Polish parliament was the National Democratic Party, or the Index. They were the party of the Polish middle class. They were intensely nationalistic, they were socially conservative, and they were avowedly anti-Semitic. They were strongly Catholic, and they enjoyed the support of the Catholic Church more than any other political group. They weren't fascists. Not properly fascist. Pilsudski's dictatorship, which ruled from 1926 to 1935, although it shared some of the forms or some of the actions of fascism, I don't think can either be described as truly fascist. It took the Depression to bring out the emergence of a true fascist movement in Poland in the form of the National Radical Party. Again, the name's important. Or the NARA. This was a full-fledged fascist program. It included what was, by now, common anti-Semitic agitation. But it wasn't fascist enough. And in 1937, fascism in Poland was led by Camp of National Unity, or Ozone, which was consciously modeled after the Italian and German totalitarian parties. Their youth group, the Union of Young Poland, spent its time outbidding the NARAs in its anti-Semitic demagoguery and attacks on Jews. The reason I bring this up is it's a mistake. It's a vital mistake to equate the plight of Poland's Jews with the country's occupation by Germany after 1939. Hugh Seton Watson, one of the major historians of Eastern Europe between the wars, says at one point in his study, the situation of the Jews of Poland and of Romania was already desperate in 1939. During the 30s, I'm quoting Seton Watson at this point, as the tide of anti-Semitism rose around them, among the Jews, even those who desired assimilation found themselves forced toward one other of two extremes to escape the anti-Semitism in Poland, communism and Zionism. Unfortunately, both communism and Zionism aggravated their condition, worsened what was going to be their fate, because both movements isolated them from ethnic nationalism. Let me look at another state. Go down the map a little bit. Since the quote I used to Seton Watson refers to Romania, let me take a look at Romania. Till 1930, Romania was really blessed among Eastern European states. It had been treated kindly by World War I. And it seems in many ways to have been, along with Czechoslovakia, among the most enlightened of the Eastern European states. I say until 1930 because in 1930, Prince Carol flew back into the country. I've got a nod back here in the back. Came back from exile, reclaimed his throne. He was a young, ambitious man. Apparently his intelligence was not quite as strong as his ambitions. He was determined to be, in his own words, a great man, a savior, a regenerator of his country. He came back to Romania an admirer of Mussolini and set out to imitate Mussolini and to reshape Romania in the fascist fashion. he established the conditions in which, in 1934, a new party, the Romanian Front, could proclaim, with the protection of the state, a program of militant anti-Semitism, as well as a denunciation of the institutions of democracy. I'm not saying that the Romanian Front invented anti-Semitism. It was there long before Carroll or it dates at least from the early 19th century. In the 1920s, we know that in Moldavia, the local university had, among its other distinctions, the distinction of being a constant source of toughs, strikebreakers, Jew-baiters, who could be pulled out of the university and out of classes to do the bidding of whomever was out there in the street. Unfortunately, under Carroll's rule, those same students formed the base for the Iron Guard. The Iron Guard promised an end to the misrule of parliamentary politicians, it promised an end to administrative dishonesty and inefficiency, an end to the gouging of Jewish shopkeepers, these are their words, not mine, obviously, as well as more land for the peasants of Romania. In 1937, in an extremely indecisive election, one in which the Iron Guard got exactly 16% of the vote, Carroll, who was an insecure king and fearful of the Guard, invited another group to form a new government. Fearful of the Guard, he invited the Transylvanian poet Goga, is it Goga? Leader of the anti-Semitic National Christian Party. It had pulled 9% of the votes, but it got to form the government. And under Goga's leadership, Jews were beaten, Jewish businesses were shut down, and Romanian economic life brought to a halt until the French and the British, who were the protectors of Romania, called a halt to it. Basically demanded that Carroll get rid of Goga, and he did so. He proclaimed himself dictator. That's not quite what the French and the British had in mind when they told him to get rid of Goga. Created a monopoly party, just like Mussolini had done in Italy, the Front of National Rebirth. Unfortunately, he lost his protection. The Germans beat the French, and there went the protection he had. And Romanian fascism at that point was turned over to General Anastasio, and I think we do know, or we will know, the rest of that history. Let me look at one more of the successor states. The Hungarians had come into the period, like the Germans, extremely unhappy. As the Treaty of Versailles was hated in Germany, or among Germans everywhere, not just in Germany, so was the Treaty of Peace, which brought Hungary to its knees, hated by Magyars everywhere. The transition of Hungary into a fascist state does not date that, though. It dates rather from the prime ministership of one General Gombos, an ethnic German, war minister prior to his appointment to prime minister. One time a leading member of a terrorist organization in Hungary known as the Awakening Magyar. The issue for him was not racial purity. The issue for him was the return of the lost lands, the ingathering of nationality. But he was the first Hungarian prime minister to actively favor the propagation of fascist ideology. Between 1931 and 1936, as prime minister, one who shared the middle class's belief that Jewish bankers had caused the Depression, he used the state to organize industry, to squeeze out Jews, and to replace them with Hungarians. In 1936, he died and got an even more virulent leader in Hungary. Unfortunately, he had to resign because it was discovered that his grandmother was Jewish. And so, at the end of this period, Hungary found itself in the hands of Count Paul Teleki, and in the hands of a new fascist group, the Arrow Cross. Fortunately for Teleki, Hungary was unique among the states of Middle Europe. It maintained far more independence of Germany and of things German than did other European states until very late in the war, until 1943, as a matter of fact. The reason for going through this litany of fascist states is I hope a pattern's emerged. A pattern which suggests that the problem we're dealing with is not German, or at least wholly German. And the problem we're dealing with certainly has to be explained by something larger than traditional Christian anti-Semitism. I'm going to stop my presentation at this point and ask if there are any questions. David, it may have been a mistake. You may have wanted me to go all the way to 5:45. Yeah.
How do you see McCarthyism in this country as falling within the pattern of fascism in Europe? Are there similarities in your mind?
There are some similarities. Sure. McCarthy was virulently anti-communist. You notice all of them are virulently anti-communist. McCarthy was anti-Semitic. They are all anti-Semitic. If we had any gypsies, I'm sure he'd be an anti too, but it wasn't worth making a thing about it. But frankly, he didn't have a full-fledged ideology. He didn't have a conception of the organic society, of the corporate state. And to be a fascist, one has to have that. I mean, you can find it in America. You can find it very, very easily in America. But it's not going to be found in Joe McCarthy. It's going to be found in the successor to Huey B. Long, Gerald L.K. Smith. In Father Coughlin, the preacher of Royal Oaks, Michigan, who used to sit there and read children's stories on the radio until he decided to try and explain the Depression. There are aspects of the corporate state of fascism in the New Deal itself, the ideology of the New Deal itself. Although I would certainly not, for a single solitary moment, accuse FDR or any of his followers of being fascist. It's a very sophisticated ideology, and Joe McCarthy, just quite frankly, wasn't that sophisticated. Mm-hmm. Didn't come to power, Yeah, no, right. I understand. No, I think that's too favorable an interpretation of Petain, and I think it's too favorable to the French. There's a mythology of French resistance, of French anti-fascism, which is far stronger than the reality of the same thing. Petain turned to Laval and Maurras, okay? And although the fascists in France did not come to power until Vichy, a lot of the paralysis of France in the interwar period can be blamed upon what is at least an ideological civil war going on in France between fascists and their enemies. Just to focus on one brand of fascism, National Socialism. lots of Frenchmen felt it would have been preferable to have had
Order of Hitler.
than a Blum. And unfortunately, Blum was not only a socialist, but also a Jew. Okay?
I think it's important for us perhaps to remember that Mussolini and Hitler stimulated whatever brand of anti-Semitism existed in various countries. That is, they stimulated, they set an example and stirred these movements more. And my question would be, to what extent, indeed, would they have been successfully developed or escalated in these various countries had not Hitler or Mussolini, and particularly Hitler, because Mussolini, and there I perhaps would have some slight disagreement, Mussolini was not really interested in promulgating anti-Semitism.
No.
He was more pushed by Hitler than initiated by Jewish law, which to be sure existed was there.
The core of fascist ideology does not include anti-Semitism. The core of fascist ideology. If you look at the commonalities of fascism, anti-Semitism is not among its core ingredients. It's a very useful ingredient for fascists.
It makes it more specific.
Yeah, all societies need scapegoats. All rulers need scapegoats. And Gypsies, Jews, Ukrainians, these unassimilatable people out there are great scapegoats. They're great scapegoats.
Weren't the Jews scapegoats made as state theology?
Oh, of course they are.
Well,
Of course they are. There's no question. I don't disagree with Rabbi Lowe's reading of Matthew. It's obvious.
I feel somewhat by your saying that you do not accept Dr. Lowe's thesis. That confuses me.
Well, I do not accept it completely. Let's start with that.
If it were not anti-Semitism, there wouldn't have been any Holocaust of the Jews.
I don't think that follows. I don't think that follows at all.
The vehicle is fascism.
There are other means by which to define Jews as unworthy of continued existence as a race. Christianity is one technique. Darwinism is another.
But Christianity was the vehicle which for 2,000 years carried this idea. And the fact that
True.
there was no Holocaust until 1943 belittles the fact that Jews...
I'm not belittling that. What I'm talking about is this stage.
All of these things occurred in 1950 years. I think what you said when you left Dr. Lowe's thesis at the beginning of your lecture was that why was there not a Holocaust, or why did it take 1950 years for the Holocaust to appear? There were Holocausts. The technique, the technology, didn't exist until the 1960s. And that's the reason why we didn't have a complete Holocaust.
Also recognize that the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of people, genocide, was something that was perpetrated. If you look at it, and I've intentionally not gone into the peculiarities of National Socialist ideology, but if you look at the race laws, the race theory, the German National Socialists, the Jews are not the only people who are unworthy of existence. Gypsies, of the 833, let's see, what is it? 863,000 that I could account for in Europe in 1939 or thereabouts. 500,000 of them are gone. I mean, we don't have much scholarship on Gypsy genocide. We need more on that. The Slavs as a race were considered, first of all, the only thing they were worth was their land and their labor. They were considered expendable. They were there to serve and die for the master race. That's the only purpose the Slavs had in existence. And it's to focus on the 6 million Jews, but it's also proper to recognize the other 6 million who were subject to the same policy for the same reasons.
But I think Dr. Lowe's thesis is one that is that the means by which Jews were identified, vilified through 2,000 years was Christian theology, not the Slavs or the Gypsies, but it was Christian theology.
Yeah, you can't blame the Gypsies for killing God. I know, and yet they too were singled out.
There was another thing that I read in Philadelphia. I think it is true, and that one of them is that I don't know, when the Russian Tsar or Russian
Alexander II.
when they would become religion with drawings. Originally, they were supposed to have drawings of Jews that were on the board that he felt was his kind of thing. And then the last minute, apparently, a Christian or I don't know what because I'm not quite clear what period it was. And it was after the Teutonic like stuff. And then, of course, then that's when everything Jewish was cleaned up in ghettos, because they wanted to make sure that I read that thing. I don't know.
I wish Steve Watchers were here. I have the foggiest idea. My knowledge of early Russian history is zip.
Accepted Byzantine Christianity. You didn't have a choice of Muslim or Jewish.
That's right. He shopped. That's right. I remember he shopped around. He was checking out the religions and
He didn't like the Muslims because they wouldn't let him drink.
Good Russian. Okay. It's that I do not place as much emphasis as Rabbi Lowe does on. I want to go back to your point on Christianity, because the Slavs were Christians, and yet they didn't rank as a race that was worthy of perpetuation. Many of the Gypsies were in fact Christians. They didn't rank as a race worthy of perpetuation. And as John Steiner will point out if I don't, the Christian church itself was declared an enemy of National Socialism. So I have difficulty with what I thought I heard as I walked out the door at 4:45 last week, being the substance of Rabbi Lowe's theory. Yeah.
There was big difficulty in Jewish understanding that the Pope did not kill anyone. Also, many Catholics say there was a real disappointment that it was not.
There was a real schism within the church, I know. And the problem, of course, is the Pope and the church hierarchy determined that fascism was preferable to communism.
So I would be so things like shifting the other direction and
No, the role of the Catholic Church during the 30s and World War II is not an admirable one. Then, as Les Adler will point out, neither was the role of the United States during that period. Yeah.
Sandy Lowe also mentioned sort of an anecdote which may or may not explain what this gentleman is referring to. When Julius Streicher was testifying in Nuremberg, he said, I didn't write that script. It's all in the New Testament. I had the script there and I just followed it. Now, he didn't say that script told me to kill Slavs and Gypsies, because it doesn't. So he gets no support from Sandy Lowe's thesis.
There's no doubt in my mind that historic Christian anti-Semitism made, if you will, more acceptable the extermination of the Jews than otherwise would have been the case, or than it was, perhaps, for Slavs and Gypsies. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. I'm not dismissing Rabbi Lowe's thesis. Please don't get me wrong there. I just don't think it's an explanation, a full and complete explanation for what we turn to in the next segment of this lecture series. John and then.
I just want to be sure that you understand that the definition from religious anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism, is not, which is really anti-Semitism, rather than religious. Hitler, Stryker, and all these people explain that it's not that they have a particular religion, but the Jewish religion is a product of their race, and not vice versa. Namely, that these are people who are unacceptable because they are born criminal, and the Jewish religion is an innate product of that criminal mind, and that is something which has been quoted over and over again by the National Socialist leadership. And this transition has not been developed by Rabelais sufficiently in order to say, yes, indeed, it is the basis on which to build the new brand, which of course is much more unsympathetic by virtue of the fact that there is no redemption in being a Jew. Prior to that, there was a possibility of redemption by becoming Christian. And that no longer was possible. The very moment every baby born was defined as criminal by birth.
You know, it's one of the more unpleasant tasks I did in getting ready for this lecture was to pick up a large volume, which was the laws of occupied Europe. And very often the laws do not carry in their titles, and frequently they don't even carry in their text a reference to Jew or Gypsy. You know what they refer to? Asocial, criminal. So you know, and I think this strengthens. Yeah. That really struck me. I was really surprised by that. And the one volume I found in our library on the genocide of the Gypsies, the author pointed out that the laws regarding the definition of what was a Gypsy were more stringent than they were of what was a Jew in terms of the fractional portion of your bloodstream that qualified you. I really do think it's the racialism that is at the heart of this. Yeah.
I had a very strange, very pragmatic answer by some friends of mine, Switzerland, who have very strong Mennonite background. They told me that in their survey, widely understood that Hitler did this because his government was bankrupt.
You've got the example of Hungary. I don't know. Paul, you had a point? Yeah. But Paul, that's no more. No, and I don't know whether they had maps in Italian schools during the 30s, but I'm sure if they did, they undoubtedly had the same, image that wherever the Romans had gone, that's where Mussolini would eventually extend his sway. One of the reasons I went into all this is that I'm absolutely convinced the final solution could not have been carried out if only the Germans had been involved. I mean, it took the willing collaboration of others, of Polish fascists, of Lithuanian fascists, of Hungarian, Romanian fascists.
And one reason why Hitler, after that Tolstoy assassinated the French attaché in Paris in 1938, November 1938, and then, everyone from the age of 16 to 60 was all the way everything.
Yeah, right.
And put into cattle cars, and it was November cold, and for 48 hours they had no food, no place to go to the bathroom, no place to sit down. They were hauled in like cattle. The German populace heard about this, and that's why they had to let everybody go, and that's why they started up with the final solution. They did, and they told the people that these people were sent to restaurants, young ones were put into work camps.
Watch blaming it on the Germans, because it's the German fascists. I mean, it's not I have a strain of Germanophobia within me, based upon my reading of modern European history. But there were Lutherans who protested. There were Catholics who protested.
I must say, I had a principal who was very well-known educator. He was strong social democrat, also very well-known educator. And after one of the scenes where we were called into the auditorium, some Palestinian German, greater German came and ripped the computer parts afterwards in his office. And don't understand what risk this was, okay? He risked everything at that moment. And he called the two girls into the five girls into his office and said, I apologize. Had I known this was going to go on, I would never have allowed you to be pregnant. And I want you to learn something. Never be ashamed of who you are. Now, unless you
That's
know
good.
Julia, the movie Julia, you don't realize how this was the atmosphere. They very shortly afterwards retired him, but they could not haul him away like they did some others because he had too much of a reputation all over as a famous educator.
One more comment or question?
Yeah, I'm very concerned with the United States and my life and my children's lives. Can you foresee a scenario in this country where we might tread on this type of path? Is there a cast of characters, Petan, Mussolini, American variety, waiting in the wings to present this type of program here?
Not at present. And all that means is it's a very peculiar combination of ingredients that must form together. We have aspects of each and every one of those ingredients within our society at all times. But I don't see the combination. But then I'm a historian, and historians are not supposed to look into crystal balls. We get into trouble when we do that. Yeah, and go ahead. Mm-hmm, 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 mm-hmm. Yeah.
Setting where people were unemployed because there was not, it was worthwhile producing materials because they couldn't, and it was very similar to what I remembered as a girl in Germany, the atmosphere in Germany at that time.
I'll give you something that ought to frighten you. The announcement 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, that I believe it's the FBI, has plans to round up every Arab American. I mean, that kind of thing ought to scare the hell out of you, because that's one of those little signs, you know. The combination of signs is what you look for a full-blown fascism. But that they would think that kind of thing was appropriate or necessary. It's just terrifying.
Well, look what happened to the Japanese American.
Sure. And we have not escaped that. John, did you want to make a comment? Okay. Are there any other? Yeah. I honest to God could not. I can refer you to a couple of works that would do so. In fact, I think I have both of those works in the citations for the statistics. Both Westman's Europe of the Dictators and Seton Watson's Eastern Europe. Yes? We have, though, as I'm doing, I hope I'm talking this thing right. We have though an unbelievably sustaining faith in institutions, and one of the things required for the rise of fascism is a total breakdown in the faith in the institutions of liberal, democratic, national nation states, and we don't have any that can get 1% of the vote that would offer a solution outside of the traditional institutional framework. Well, sure, we've got those idiots who took over the Democratic Party in Illinois, and they're the type I'd worry about. But well, for one thing, we've got how many amendments to the Constitution written 200 years ago? We've made a handful of fragmentary modifications in the oldest written document on the face of the earth, which governs a currently existing state. That to me is one of the most telling signs of all. We've had some real questionable people hold the office of president, and yet nobody seriously proposes that we change the system. Sure, you've got some cockeyed, ivory-towered college professors who say, "Oh, let's use the British model of parliamentary democracy." In these discussions about the bicentennial of the Constitution, but nobody seriously wants to play around with the tripartite division of power. The last serious attempt to play around with the Supreme Court was FDR's, and it clobbered the heck out of it. The basic institutional framework we seem to have an abiding faith in. I don't know why, but for some reason we even have abiding faith in the two-party system. And as I say, I haven't the foggiest idea why, but we do. And one of the keys to success of a movement like fascism is it's got to get into the political arena. It's got to get 6 vote or 15%. It's got to get some percent. It's got to have a place from which it can operate. You can't do that. The Republican and Democratic parties have written the rules. in a way which makes that damn near impossible, and the rest of us seem to be quite happy with that, with their rules.
You don't see Pat Robertson or LaRouche making any real inroads into the two-legged party?
No. Oh, God, don't. I'm a historian. I'm sure it's... Okay, it's 5:45, and I think it's time that I stop. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it has something to do with, I don't know, I see the language dimensions, so I'm bringing it up there. I don't think that anti-Semitism just magically appeared after the death of Jesus Christ, because, well, it was, yeah, because you look at the annihilation of Samaria, the annihilation of Judea, and Antiochus Epiphanes desecrating the temple, and the Romans thinking about it. Right.
There's Christian
Right.
There is also anti-Semitism. There's probably anti-Semitism. I don't know, but there probably is.
So yeah, it just seems an antiquity seems to be there. Now you're running the history credit?
Yeah.
Okay, because I already talked to Bob Brown about a paper, so should I?
Fine, you can work with Bob. That's fine.
Okay, I didn't know how that
But
worked.
if you haven't worked, if you already, I'll take care of it if you haven't already.
Yeah, I've worked with
If you
Bob.
have, then go ahead.
He was
Go
first.
ahead,
Oh,
you're a student.
Oh, okay. I was yeah, I'm taking the course through the history department. Okay. So you want like a 2 or 3 page paper, somewhat
That
summary
reaction
and
paper?
somewhat our opinion? Is that what you
Yes,
want?
right. I'd like a very short summary, because you and I, and everybody here, hopefully has read that book, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your evaluation of it, and your reaction.
All right. And as far as the paper, now I'm only taking the 2 units.
Very short, based upon secondary reading only.
Okay. Like, do you have some should we just bring in a topic and
Yeah,
have
bring in a topic, and it's not so much that I improve it, I want to make sure it's manageable within the length of time that you really ought to spend.
Okay.
I don't want you trying to do a doctoral dissertation.
Right. Well, that was why I
Encourage you in
didn't
a
go any
class.
further, is because I substitute most days, and I'm taking class on Wednesday nights, and I thought with the family, you can do so much.
That's right.
And I was afraid if it made it be 4 hours, that I wouldn't be able to do the.
So just let me have a chance to say, wait a minute, that's going to take you 2 years, and you only have 11 weeks left, or 12 weeks left.
Okay, fine, and that isn't due till somewhat near the end, though.
Right.
So right now it's just.
Paper would be at the end of it.
Okay, so in the next 2 weeks, then I'll get the reaction paper then.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just identifying what are causes for things that happen, like this extermination, and what are perhaps you could call snowball effects.